Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm your host for today, Stephen, and I'll be speaking with Professor Hajin Kim from the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Kim is an assistant professor of law. She received her BA in economics from Harvard, her JD from Stanford Law School, and her PhD from Stanford's Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. Before attending Stanford, she worked for the Boston Consulting Group, clerked for Judge Paul Watford of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and also clerked for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her work examines how moral and social influence can shape environmental regulation and firm behavior. Professor Kim is here today to talk to us about her career path and how she became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Kim. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. This sounds like such a great program.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you on. First, could you just please tell us what your position is at UChicago and how would you describe, your research interests and what you teach to a layperson outside of that field?
Sure. So I'm an assistant law professor. So I'm at the law school. And my research interests, I guess, in terms of outcomes, I'm very interested in environmental regulation and just how we can better protect the environment. And I take a kind of unusual approach to that because I consider not just, the traditional governmental tools we think of, pollution taxes, command and control, regulation, those types of things, but also market responses. We know now, for example, there's been a huge rise in investor and consumer and employee push for corporations to do more and to care more outside just shareholder profits, and so that's a big part of what I study. So my training is in social psychology, and so I take that those methods and that lens to my work.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, again, just to sort of set the scene, could you just give us an overview of your career path, beginning in college to where you are now? Yeah, well, what have you done? What institutions have you been a part of?
Sure. So when I went to college, I fell in love with economics, and so I was an economics major. I loved Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, and so mostly focused on issues of trade. My parents are immigrants, and so I was especially interested in trade, kind of from an immigrant perspective. And so that's what I did my senior thesis on. Immediately after college, I went to Korea, where my parents are from, and I worked for a Korea's first venture-backed startup for half a year. And then I actually just, this is like my gap year. So I took Mandarin lessons in Korea, which was fantastic because I took some Korean classes in college, but I am by no means a native speaker. I can get by, but that's about it. And so I learned all the sort of grammar rules in like what grammar words were in Korean so that I could learn Mandarin. So that was awesome. And then I went and I worked for BCG, which is a management consulting firm in Chicago, actually. My then boyfriend, now husband, was at UFC law school at the time, actually. So I worked at BCG for 3 years, and he was in law school. And then I sat in on one of the USC law classes. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I kind of had this environmental awakening while I was working at BCG and decided I really wanted to work on environmental issues. Didn't know how, and I sat in on one of his law school classes with Saul Levmore and just fell in love with law. And so I ended up applying to law school. I went to Stanford and started my JD. In my first year, I decided this is fantastic. I love law school, but also I want to do research. And so
Mhm.
I applied in my first year to do a joint PhD. Miraculously, they took me. And so I joined the PhD program in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. So that's a whole mouthful. We call it EIPER. The basic point is you take two disciplines. So my disciplines were essentially social psychology and law, or social psychology and policy, and you use them to look at particular issues that you care about. So this awesome, fantastic, really free-ranging intellectual experience. So I started my first 2 years of the PhD concurrently with my last 2 years of the law degree. And then once I finished the law degree and my first 2 years of the PhD, I left my PhD for a year to clerk on the Ninth Circuit for Judge Watford in Pasadena. It's basically the coolest job you can have as a young lawyer. Um, and then I finished that clerkship and went back for a year to my PhD. And then I left my PhD again for another year to clerk for Justice Ginsburg at the Supreme Court, which was an amazing year. I mean, really depressing in some ways,
Mm.
but also amazing. And then I came back and finished my PhD. And after I finished my PhD, I was so lucky to join the faculty here. So that's my career.
Okay. Wow. That's a whole lot that we covered and that you covered in just a few minutes there. But one question going way back is before all this, when you were a kid, maybe like middle or high school years, what were your interests then? And what did you think at that point you were going to end up doing?
Oh, I had no idea. I mean, I kind of I loved school, so I always thought maybe I would do some. I didn't really know what being a professor was, but I thought maybe I will do something like a professor because I just love being in school. I wrote on my college applications that I was going to be a history major because I knew what history was and I didn't know what a lot of the other subjects were. But I could have very easily been an engineering major, or I just really had no idea.
Gotcha. Yeah. As you were honing in on this area, who were some people who influenced and supported you in terms of your academic journey? Like, who are some people who've really been there to support you?
You know, it's hard to there's so many people that I don't know even where to begin. So, in college, I was an economics major because I fell in love with economics. But the reason I fell in love with economics is because I had this amazing. I think everyone else calls them TAs, but we call them TFs. She taught most of my class, and Katie Kerr. I will never forget her because she was so brilliant, and she made all the topics so accessible and so interesting that I really wanted to study economics. And I remember sitting down with her and asking for advice, like, should I study this? I like it, but I don't know. Like maybe I should do some of the other things that allow for a broader reach. And she was just like, well, you love it. Why not just try it? And so she was a big influence. My professors in law school and my advisors in my PhD program were, I just got so lucky. I had the most wonderful people, mentors in both capacities supporting me. Some of my law school professors were also my advisors, and some of my law school professors, some of them are just friends now who continue. Like even in law school, I would ask them, "Oh, I don't know what to do with this problem I'm having with my family or anything," and they would just be so generous with their time and helpful in helping me think through things. So both personally and professionally, I think they've been incredibly helpful. My judge, Judge Watford, who I clerked for in Pasadena, has always been incredibly supportive and somebody I can turn to anytime I have questions or want to ask advice. I asked some advice questions of Justice Ginsburg, but I felt it was a little harder to ask her questions because I didn't want to bother her. I knew she was so busy. I mean, Judge Watford is also extremely busy. She was not unapproachable, but I just didn't want to be taking up her time. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel very lucky that I've had so many wonderful influences in my career.
That's great to hear. You mentioned your sort of gap year also. How do you think your experiences abroad affected your approach to law and to the kinds of questions that you study now?
It's a good question. So I studied abroad in Chile. And then I did my gap year in Korea. At least my study abroad in Chile was much more informative for my undergraduate work because I was so interested in trade. And Chile and South Korea had just completed the Chile South Korea free trade agreement, and so I went there and sort of saw how that did bring many more Koreans into Santiago and changed the sort of immigrant experience there. I can tell you the really loose sort of long story, which is um, so this is my environmental awakening. It happened in Korea.
Yeah,
So
I'd love to hear about that.
okay, so the summer after my first year of college, I was in Korea and I was living with my aunt, and I hadn't really gone to Korea at all since I think this is my first trip to Korea since I had been 3 years old or something. And in Korea, there's a real emphasis on eating seasonally, and that's because there's so many farmers in Korea, and it's just way cheaper to eat seasonally. And this was before, local foods or whatever was such a big deal here in America.
Mhm.
And so it was the summer, so we ate lots of tomatoes. We ate watermelon. As it got later, we ate a lot of grapes. And it was interesting because my aunt kept being like, "Oh, this is in season, so we should eat it. Oh, this is in season, so we should eat it." And I was used to going to the grocery store, and everything was effectively in season. You could just
Yeah.
buy anything, right? And but what I realized is everything in Korea was just so much more delicious, and it was weird because I had just learned about Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage and trade and how much trade lifts all boats. But then I guess in my gap year when I was back in Korea, and after finishing my undergraduate work, I read Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle, and there she talks about some of the externalities of trade, which in econ we at the time were just like, oh, externalities. you can get rid of those with like a pollution tax or whatnot. And of course, we're not doing that. And then she also talked about, which I thought was so interesting, was that a lot of the tomatoes that we have in the US are bred for storage and transport, not for taste. And of
Mm.
course, because it's the kind of product that you buy and you don't know that it tastes bad until after you buy it, that those incentives totally make sense. And so I realized, oh, I used to get in these arguments with my aunt in Korea, like saying, "Oh, we shouldn't have Korea shouldn't have so much protection for its farmers. This doesn't make any sense. It makes all the prices. This is why fruit in Korea is so expensive." But the fruit in Korea was also much more delicious. And so I hadn't realized, oh, there can be these sort of downsides to trade, and we're not like thinking about them at all. And so that made me think, oh, really, more people need to be working on environmental problems. So yeah, so my time in Korea led to my environmental passion, along
Yeah.
with the Barbara King solver.
Okay, that's really interesting, and it's not something that I had thought about before, certainly. How did you sort of find your way to environmental law? Like, what was there a moment where that all kind of clicked, and you decided to set off down that path?
No, it was actually the opposite route. So essentially, I became interested in environmental issues. I was consuming as much sort of environmental media as I could,
Hmm.
and I knew that's what I wanted. So, a lot of people look at BCG as and consulting as sort of one of my friends calls it a finishing school, which you go there, but it's not always. It's not. It's often not your sort of terminal career destination. Like you sort of
Yeah,
know you're learning skills there, and then you want to take those skills and apply them to whatever is going to be your real career, quote unquote. And so I wanted to go to graduate school, but I didn't know what kind of graduate school. And so I went to and sat in on this law class and just was like, this is so much fun. I want to do this.
gotcha. Well, is there something that you would aspire to do beyond where you are now, or are there areas that you think you may eventually, want to explore that you haven't yet?
I just started teaching in 2020, in fall of 2020. So it's still really new to me and I love it. I love teaching. I love getting to do research that I'm interested in. And so I feel like I don't have the mental space now to think about like, well, what else do I want to do?
Fair
I
enough. Yeah.
what I feel like is I just want to get better at all the things I'm doing. I want to be a better teacher. I want to be a better researcher. I want to be a better like all the things. Um, so that's what I've been focusing on. I mean, I guess before I got into teaching, I kind of thought, I have these sort of professor mentors who I look up to, and what I think is really unique about some people is they are able to do both either policy or litigation alongside their more academic work. And I think like once I feel like I have more mastery of the basics, I shouldn't call them the basics, but like the core of being a professor, I would love to be able to do that. I think it enriches your work. I think it enriches your teaching to be able to, because at the end of the day, if you're teaching at a law school, you're teaching folks who are going to go off and be lawyers or litigators, lawyers, transactional lawyers, policymakers, and so on. And so it's nice if you can bring more of that sort of real world experience to your classroom. And it's nice if you can bring more of the real world into your research too, to make it just more externally valid or ecologically valid. So I guess in the future, I would like to be able to add those components, but right now I don't have that kind of mind space.
Yeah, that's interesting. How does it look to teach law students, and what is your research? What does that actual work look like for you?
Yeah, so teaching law students is delightful. They generally come to class very well prepared, interested in the material. So I've been teaching mostly environmental law topics. I'll also teach property law this coming year. But yeah, I love teaching law students. I think um, it's a lot of work. It's so much preparation, even though I've taught or TA'd, for example, environmental law. This was my third or fourth year. And so you would think by now it's old hat, but I feel like it's still, when I'm in the teaching mode, every waking moment, I just want to be prepping and like figuring out a better way to either like a deeper understanding of the material myself or a better way to convey it or some activity that would make it more fun.
Mhm.
So it's been like a real fun, like creative challenge. Um, in terms of my research day to day, uh, it can be so different every day. So I do a lot of empirical work where I run studies. And so I could be designing a study one day and running it, paying participants, and then analyzing the data. Um, or I could be like today, I'm going to spend a lot of the day editing a paper. And so I'm just basically in Word and like shifting paragraphs around, cutting, deleting, rewriting, killing all my darlings, as I say.
Mhm.
Um, Or, I could be drafting. So another thing I'll do today is draft a proposal for a study that will circulate and ask for comments on. And so that's just sort of laying out the motivation and drawing up the skeleton of here are the things here's how we would run this, so that we can ask people to give us feedback. So it can really be different day to day. One thing that's lovely about U Chicago Law School is we value collaborative work, which is not true in all law schools. And I love co-authoring papers because I just think the end result ends up it's a more fun process because you get to bounce ideas off colleagues and friends, but it's also, I think, because of that, it ends up you get a better result. So I'm really, really happy that I can do that. So it's funny because a lot of people think academia is very monastic, but
Yeah.
I actually don't think that's true. So so many disciplines now are, so many disciplines now value co-authorship, and so it becomes much more team-based than you would expect.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's cool. That's yeah, that's interesting. We we've been asking people what are some fun and some not so fun parts of being a professor. I mean, you mentioned some challenges, but yeah, is there anything in part of the job that is just not that fun to you? You know.
I hate grading. I'm
Okay.
sure everybody says that. I'm sure everyone says they hate grading. It sucks. I mean, I just like I try very hard to make it, very objective. It's all blinded and I have a point system and I assign points to everything and I do, but it's unless it's a multiple choice test or like a math test where there's a right and wrong answer, it's inherently somewhat subjective. And so you just feel kind of crappy the whole time you're grading. So yeah, I hate grading.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a straightforward answer, and you are correct. You are not the first person to give that one.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, okay, so one important question is just what advice would you give to people who are considering entering this field?
Um, I think it's really important to expand your interests and horizons and read and take classes very broadly because you have no idea how things will end up combining to like make sense to you. Also just talk to lots of people, talk to them about your ideas and don't be afraid. So some of my some of the projects I'm most interested in came out of really intense debates and discussions with people I look up to, who disagreed with me, and I wanted to sort of pinpoint, well, what's the source of that disagreement? Oh, that's an empirical question. Oh, we should just test that.
Mm,
Um, so I think just keeping an open mind and being curious about the world is a great way to start.
okay, yeah. Well, yeah, I'm curious, like, what is something that is going on in your field right now? What's going on that is really inspiring you right now?
Hmm. It's funny. I just came off of maternity leave and then taught, and I feel like more than inspiration right now, I just have this. There's so many things I want to get done, and
Hmm.
so I mean, so my colleagues inspire me every day and like how much dedication they put towards teaching. So, for example, I'm teaching property law this winter. I'm really looking forward to it. And I've been talking to and I'm reaching out to other colleagues who have taught it before. And the level of care they put into their notes and lectures and the problem sets and everything that they put together for their students, that is definitely very inspiring and also quite daunting. Um, my colleagues are also, they're just so bright. And what I said about like people like you should read widely and be sort of broadly curious. I think that's very true of my faculty. And so I go to these workshops and the comments that people are able to make on areas of law and areas of so one thing about law school is researchers okay, so you're all sort of researching law-ish topics, legal topics, right? But you could be researching criminal law with an empirical background like Sonia Starr, or you could be researching constitutional law with history, like Farah Peterson. Like you could have so many different disciplines and so many different areas of law. And so, there's a professor at Stanford who calls law schools the last bastion of generalists. What's very inspiring is to go to these workshops and see my colleagues able to really make I mean, not that I can totally judge, but like what seem to be brilliant comments and constructive suggestions for areas that seem wildly outside of their field and their area. Um, and so that's just like such a cool ideal to strive towards, right? To be able to cross boundaries and really like think broadly that way.
Yeah, going off of that, I'm curious if you could, talk a little bit more about how some of your experiences outside of the law or outside of the sort of environmental field have impacted the way that you approach questions about the environment. I mean, you talked about trade and that awakening.
Yeah, of course. So when I was at BCG, I was working with a bunch of companies, and it was really strange to me how everyone, my friends who are mostly liberally leaning, they would talk about corporations as these sort of megalith, nameless, faceless entities that were just evil. And I was working with a lot of clients at these companies, and I thought they were generally well-meaning, good people who tried to do good things. And so one of my research projects is actually about corporate motivations and corporate prosociality. And it kind of came about because, on the one hand, you have this is a crazy oversimplification, but you have the sort of academic theorists in political science and economics who would say, oh, corporations are profit maximizing only, and they're this sort of these soulless machines. And then you also have these sort of some folks on the political spectrum who would say corporations are necessarily evil, and I thought that was not true from what I had seen from my work at BCG. Particularly, there were companies that we advised who were privately held companies, and this was before ESG and the rise of voluntary pro-social corporate CSR was really a big thing, and they would sort of quietly do these more expensive things to help the environment or whatever. And so I thought, oh, there's a disconnect here, and I wonder if the disconnect is actually itself problematic, right? So this is a lot of my work on expectations, is how expectations can sort of bring about the expected behavior. So we know this is true with self-interest. If you expect people to be if you tell people, this is, they're the famous studies on econ students or econ classes. If you tell people that self-interest is both normatively appropriate, that it is, in fact, something you should be self-interested because that helps the market, the invisible hand of the market, and descriptively accurate, that most people are mostly self-interested. They act in a more self-interested way.
Mhm.
This is also true about growth mindset. So this is a big deal now in a lot of schools. You try to teach growth mindset where you say, well, if you think that if you have a fixed mindset, if you think your intelligence level is fixed, then if you do poorly on a math test, you might think, oh, I must just not be good at math. So then why try? Or if you do really well, then you might think, oh, I'm really smart at math, but now I'm scared of trying because I could disprove the fact that I'm smart. But if you have a growth mindset and you say, oh, this is something, intelligence can be earned in a way. You can work up and build your skills in math, and students work harder both if they get a bad score or if they do a good score, because they realize it's the product of effort, not necessarily just fixed ability. And so in this way, if you expect that students can get better, or if you expect that students are going to be fixed, that also tends to beget that behavior, right? And so with in corporations, if we expect that corporations are only going to be evil, then if they do something good, then you might think, oh, they're just doing that. They're either greenwashing, they're lying about it, or it's somehow going to be profit maximizing. So I don't want to reward them for that. I'm not going to go out of my way to buy their products or work for them or invest in them. And then if they do something bad, you kind of think, oh, well, of course they're going to do something bad because they're just profit maximizing, right? And this is not to conflate profit maximizing with profits with evil. Profits are good in lots of ways. I was an econ major. I love profits. Lots of profits are great.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to get at is like maybe this sort of disconnect between what I was seeing when I was advising clients at BCG and what both academics, some academics, and some of my liberal leaning friends were saying, like maybe this is actually bad for us. So that is sort of the basis for some of my projects.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. A bit of nuance there. Our final question is simply, what is the most gratifying thing that you do in your job?
Oh, what is the most gratifying thing I do in my job? I mean, it has to be teaching, right? Like it's like I love doing my research, but with teaching and you know, it's interesting. There's a sort of embedded question here in what is gratifying for you, right?
Right. Right.
And so I love doing my research and I find so much inspiration and joy in my research. But when you say the word gratifying, like seeing students understand something that you think is kind of complex is the best feeling in the world, because then you feel like, oh my gosh, I did it. I mean, it's really because the students are super smart and they did all the work to get there, but you get to tell yourself you did something amazing. You got to help them get there, right? So yeah, it has to be teaching.
All right. Well, Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Professor Hajin Kim, for your time today. Course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the others. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. See you around.